The campsite was nestled deep within the forest miles from the nearest road. The only sounds were the soft rustling of the wind through the trees and the distant chirping of crickets. A fire crackled in the center of the clearing, its flickering light casting shadows across the tents and the faces of Thesmol group gathered around it. Mark leaned back in his folding chair, holding a beer in one hand and a flashlight in the other. He aimed a beam at his wife Lisa, who sat across from him, her face partially illuminated by the warm glow of the fire. "The scariest place you've ever been?" he asked, grinning. Lisa shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. "Maybe here it's so remote. What if we're not alone? Oh, spooky," Brian, Mark's best friend, teased. He clinked his beer bottle against Lisa's and winked. "Don't worry, if a bear shows up, I'll fight it off for you." "Mark," laughed Brian, "versus a bear, my money's on the bear." The group burst into laughter, the familiar comfort of old friends pushing back against the chilly air of the forest night. But as the fire burned lower and the beers kept flowing, the jokes grew quieter and the silences stretched longer. The shift in mood was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Mark could feel it. He'd always been good at picking up on things left unsaid. Lisa and Brian were sitting closer now, their heads bent together as they whispered and laughed. It could have been innocent, after all they had known each other 4 years, but something about it unsettled Mark. He watched them from the corner of his eye, his smile tightening with every lingering touch. Every sharp glance. By midnight, the fire had dwindled to little more than glowing embers. Sarah and Jake, the other couple on the trip, had already retreated to their tent. Rand stretched, yawning dramatically, and patted his stomach. "I'm calling it a night," he said. "Don't let the forest monsters get you." "Good night," Lisa murmured softly. Mark watched as Brian disappeared into Heistent, then turned to Lisa. "You coming, Hesked?" Lisa shook her head. "Not yet. I think I'll stay out here a little longer. It's so peaceful." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "All right, don't stay up too late." Inside their tent, Mark lay awake, listening to the muffled sounds of the forest. Time passed, but Lisa didn't join him. His mind raced each passing minute, feeding his unease. Finally, he unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The fire pit was dark, and the clearing was empty. Lisa's chair was abandoned, her blanket draped over the back. A quick glance at Brian's tent showed it was zip shut, but something about the stillness fell off Mark's stomach. Twisted, he walked forward, his footsteps silent on the damp ground. Just outside the tent, he froze, his heart hammered in his chest. From inside he heard the unmistakable sound of whisper, slow and urgent, and then a soft laugh. Lisa's laugh. Mark's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his throat tightening. For a moment he stood there, frozen. Mark felt as though he might suffocate from his own breath. Without thinking, he yanked the zipper down, the sudden noises slicing to the quiet night. The flashlight in his hand flared to life, casting harsh light into the small space. Lisa and Brian scrambled away from each other, their faces pale and shocked. Brian's shirt was unbuttoned and Lisa's hair was a mess. They stared at Mark, mouths opening and closing as if trying to find the right words. Mark didn't wait for them to speak. He turned on his heel and walked into the forest, the beam of his flashlight bouncing erratically. Ash pushed through the thick underbrush behind him. He heard Lisa calling his name. Her voice filled with panic, but he didn't stop. The darkness enveloped him, the trees closing in like silent sentinels. He walked for what seemed like hours, his mind a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. Eventually he reached a small clearing. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a strange, eerie glow over everything. Mark collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving. As he struggled to catch his breath, he thought of Lisa. Her smile, her laugh, the way she used to look at him. Then Brian, his oldest friend, the man who had stood by his side at their wedding. The weight of the betrayal crushed him, a pain so physical it left him gasping. The forest seemed to close, and around him the shadows grew deeper and the air turned colder. Somewhere in the distance a branch snapped. Mark's head jerked up, his eyes scanning the darkness. He wasn't alone. The sound came again, closer, this time rustling in the bushes, leaves crunching beneath footsteps. Mark scrambled to his feet, his flashlight darting across the trees. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice strained. No answer, just a slow, deliberate sound of footsteps moving closer. Mark backed away, his pulse pounding in his ears, His flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging him into darkness. Panic surged through him as he fumbled with the flashlight, slapping it against his palm. The footsteps stopped. Silence. It was the kind of silence that made his skin crawl. Then a low, guttural growl shattered the stillness. Mark's breath caught in his throat without thinking. He turned Andrin. The darkness disoriented him as he stumbled through the trees, the growl echoing behind him, deep, menacing, and growing louder with every step. He didn't know what was chasing him, but he didn't dare look back. His foot caught on a root, and he fell hard. The impact knocking the breath out of him, he rolled onto his back, his hands scrambling for anything he could use as a weapon. The growl was right above him. Now a hot, foul breath washing over his face. The last thing Mark saw were glowing yellow eyes, unblinking before everything went black. The next morning, Lisa and Brian found Mark in the clearing. He lay there, his face pale, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. His body was untouched. No wounds or marks to explain what had happened. But his expression told a story of terror, of something that had followed him from the darkness and claimed him. Lisa screamed, but Brian pulled her away. "We need to go," he said, his voice shaking as they fled the campsite. Neither of them noticed a pair of yellow eyes watching from the shadows, unblinking. Hungry later that night, Lisa sat in her living room sipping from a glass of wine, the events of the previous day replayed over and over in her mind. Brian had dropped her off hours ago, both of them shaken, but something about his insistence that they never speak of it again felt wrong. She stared at her phone, tempted to call someone, perhaps the police or her sister, anyone who could offer some clarity, but she didn't. Instead, she turned on the TV, letting the sound fill the silence of her empty house. The wine helped dull the edges of her fear, but it couldn't erase the memory of Mark's expression, the frozen look of pure, unadulterated terror outside. The wind picked up, rattling the windows. Lisa stood and moved to close them, feeling the chill seep into the room. She reached for the latch. Lisa caught sight of something moving in the yard, her breath catching in her throat. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, shifted just beyond the tree line. "Bree," she called out instinctively, her voice trembling. But the shadow didn't respond. Instead, it drew closer, the dim glow of yellow eyes emerging from the darkness. Lisa staggered backward, her heart hammering. The glass of wine slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. She barely noticed the sound as she grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling to dial Justice. She was about to press the button. The lights in her house flickered, then went out entirely. The room was swallowed by darkness, and the last thing Lisa heard was a low, guttural growl in impossibly close. Meanwhile, Brian sat in his apartment, unable to sleep. Mark's lifeless eyes haunted him, a vivid image that appeared every time he tried to close his own. He tried to convince himself it was just some tragic accident. Heart attack, shock, anything but what he feared most. That something unnatural had taken Mark. A soft knock on his door startled him. It started tentative, almost hesitant, but then grew louder, more insistent. Brian hesitated, his pulse quickening. He grabbed a kitchen knife before cautiously approaching the door. "Who is it?" he called, his voice shaky. There was no answer, but knock came again, followed by a low growl that sent ache down his spine. Brian stepped back, gripping the knife tightly. Slowly the doorknob turned, creaking in the stillness of the apartment. Brian's breath hitched as the door swung open, revealing nothing but darkness. Then just beyond the threshold he saw them, the yellow eyes glowing and unblinking. Brian screamed as the darkness lunged toward him. The next day, Lisa's house lay silent. When the police arrived after a neighbor reported hearing screams, they found not trace of her, only an overturned wine glass, a shattered phone, and claw marks deeply gouged into the wooden floorboards. The marks led to the window, which was wide open. Despite the morning chill, weeks passed, and whispers of Lisa's disappearance joined the growing legend of the cursed forest. Locals spoke of yellow eyes and shadows that moved without sound. Hunters reported missing dogs, their leashes found snapped near the edge of the woods. Each new story added to the unease surrounding the area. Brian's apartment was abandoned. Friends who checked on him found a kitchen knife lying on the floor, its blade bent as if it had struck something harder than steel. The door hung ajar, scratches marring its surface. A single word was scrawled on the wall in what appeared to be ash: "Run." But there was nowhere to run. The darkness spread. It began with hushed whispers among hikers who ventured too close to the forest, then sightings of fleeting shadows glowing eyes and a sense of something watching. Soon people began locking their doors at sunset, holding their breath as they listened for the telltale growl one night. A local historian named Evelyn decided to investigate armed with a flashlight and her grandfather's old revolver. She ventured into the woods. She carried journals filled with accounts of strange occurrences, convinced that she could uncover the truth behind the legends and put an end to the fear. Her notes told of an ancient curse tied to a forgotten ritual, performed by settlers who vanished centuries ago. Evelyn was methodical, marking her path with brightly colored ribbons. The further she went, the colder became the silence was oppressive. By the time she reached the heart of the forest, her flashlight was dimming. Against the oncoming darkness, there she found an altar, its surface etched with faintly glowing runes. At its base were offerings, bones, feathers, and shards of glass that seemed to hum with energy. As Evelyn studied the altar, the forest came alive with sounds. Branches creaked, leaves rustled, and whispers surrounded her. She turned her flashlight, and the beam caught the gleam of yellow eyes, dozens of them. Evelyn raised her revolver, her hands trembling. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice breaking, but the shadow surged forward, the growls drowning out her cries. The next morning, all that remained of Evelyn were her journals scattered among the leaves and a single ribbon tied to a LWH hanging branch. Her disappearance became yet another tale in the growing darkness, another warning to those who dare to enter the cursed woods. Now even the bravest stayed away. The yellow eyes watched from the edges, patient and hungry. The whispers promised that the darkness would not be contained. Much longer. Months later, a team of researchers arrived, determined to solve the mystery once and for all. Equipped with cameras, audio recorders, and thermal imaging devices, the group led by Dr. Margarita Holloway, a renowned folklorist, believed they could debunk the growing legends and uncover a rational explanation for the disappearances. Thestries are rooted in fear and myth, Dr. Holloway told her team as they set up camp near the forest edge. The team had come to distinguish fact from fiction. Comprising 6 members, each specialized in a different field, they were determined to uncover the truth. David, the tech expert; Elena, a biologist; Max, a skeptical journalist; Fiona, the paranormal investigator; and Ethan, the survivalist, all brought their own unique perspectives to the expedition. As night fell on their first evening, they gathered around a small campfire, much like Mark and his friends had months earlier. But unlike Mark's group, their search rears were equipped with scientific tools and a clear sense of purpose. They exchanged theories and laughed nervously, but the eerie presence of the forest seemed to hang over them. Dr. Halle unfurled a map marked with key locations based on local accounts. "We'll pair up tomorrow and investigate these areas," she said, pointing to specific spots on the map. "Keep your radios on and stay close to your partner." As the group dispersed to their tents, a low growl echoed through the forest. Fiona froze, her hand instinctively clutching her camera. "Did anyone else hear that?" she asked, her voice tense. Ethan, heiss expression. Sirius nodded. "Could be an animal, a big one." But Fiona wasn't convinced. She held her camera close, determined to capture any evidence of the strange sounds. She climbed into heart arsing. As a growl echoed in the distance. The next day, the team split into pairs. Dr. Halle and David went to explore the old settlers' ruins. Max and Elena investigated the nearby lake, and Fiona and Ethan headed toward the heart of the forest. Each pair carried walkie-talkies and weapons, prepared for whatever they might encounter. For most of the team, the day passed uneventfully. But Fiona and Ethan's journey took a killing turn as they approached the area where Evelyn's journals had been discovered. The forest grew unnervingly quiet. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded away. Fiona stopped abruptly, her camera aimed at a distant shadow. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan squinted, gripping his machete. "I don't see anything." But Fiona was insistent. She moved closer, the shadow becoming clear through her camera lens. "It's watching us," she murmured, her voice barely audible. A growl rumbled from the shadows, low and menacing. Ethan stepped in front of Fiona, raising his machete. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice firm. The shadow lunged at them faster than any human could move. Fiona screamed, dropping her camera as the creature collided with Ethan. The radio crackle was static as Fiona frantically reached for it, her hands trembling. "Darway, we need help," she cried, her voice filled with panic. It's real, it's real." But the radio went silent, the growls and Fiona's frantic breathing overwhelming. The static back at the campsite. Dr. Holloway and the others listened in horror, unable to reach Fiona. And Ethan, we need to find them, Max exclaimed, grabbing a flashlight. No, Dr. Holloway replied, her voice shaking. We need Torre group and plan. Going in without preparation will only make things worse. The growls intensified over the radio, followed by a scream that tore through the static like a blade. Then silence. The force had claimed Fiona and Ethan. Their remaining team members spent hours searching, finding only Fiona's shattered camera and Ethan's machete, both covered in deep claw marks. Dr. Holloway called for an evacuation, but as they waited for rescue, the shadows grew bolder, one by one. The team members were taken by the darkness, their instruments captured, fleeting glimpses of glowing eyes and impossibly fast movements, but no footage ever survived. By the time help arrived, only Dr. Hui remained. She was trembling and incoherent, her account becoming the final entry in the legend of the cursed forest, a chilling testament to the darkness that could not be contained. As the forest grew denser, the whispers grew louder, and the yellow eyes became more numerous. The darkness was spreading, and the world braced for the day it would finally reach beyond the trees.